Now, when most people picture feudal Japan, they think of samurai with shiny swords, maybe a few cherry blossoms floating through the air, and a dramatic bow or two. But beneath that romantic image lay a rigid social structure. Think of it like a giant pyramid, except instead of golden bricks, the foundation was human suffering. At the top were the shoguns and daimyo, military lords who controlled vast territories. Below them, their loyal samurai, sworn to codes of honor, and at the bottom, peasants, merchants, artisans, and women, more often than not, existed at the very bottom rung, no matter what family they were born into. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about contracts, property, and let's be honest, control. A samurai wife, for instance, wasn't exactly expected to pick out drapes and enjoy tea with friends. She was expected to run the household with military precision, produce heirs, and remain utterly obedient. The ideal wife was praised for her silence, which is another way of saying, women were admired when they weren't heard at all. Of course, silence didn't mean safety. Samurai wives were subject to the whims of their husbands, who, with the right excuse, or sometimes no excuse, could cast them aside. Divorce could be as simple as handing over a letter. A husband didn't need much of a reason. Disobedience, infertility, or simply boredom. All grounds for dismissal. Romantic, isn't it? Let's drift for a moment into the life of the lower classes. For peasant women, things weren't much gentler. They worked the fields, raised children, cooked, cleaned, and managed households while their husbands labored. If you're sensing a theme, it's because there was one: work, endless work. And the idea of personal freedom, well, that was reserved for stories, not reality. And then there were women in the licensed pleasure districts. You might have heard of them, the famous geisha, or before them, the oiran. These women were celebrated as paragons of beauty and grace. They shaped fashion, poetry, even music. But behind the painted faces and ornate hairpins was a life of contract and confinement. Many of these women had been sold into the profession as children. By the time they became admired figures in Yoshiwara or Kyoto, they were already living in gilded cages, admired, desired, but rarely free. Let's not forget about the darker traditions either. In some samurai households, the practice of junshi, the ritual suicide of retainers and sometimes even wives after the death of their lord, was seen as honorable. Yes, you heard that correctly. Honor occasionally required women to follow their husbands into death, whether they wanted to or not. A beautiful system of loyalty, if you're the one at the top. Considerably less beautiful if you're the one being volunteered. And then there were daughters. Families with too many mouths to feed often made desperate choices. Some girls were sent into servitude, others sold into entertainment districts. A daughter's value wasn't measured by her dreams or talents, but by what she could bring or relieve from the family's burden. We might pause here and think, wasn't there any space for women to carve out some kind of power? Well, yes, but it was rare and usually came with heavy irony. A woman from a samurai family could wield influence within the home, managing finances and overseeing the household. Some even acted as warriors in times of crisis. Onabugeisha, female samurai. They trained with the naginata, a long polearm. They defended castles. They led other women into battle when men were away. And yet, even their bravery was often rewritten in chronicles as curiosities. Exceptional, but not to be repeated. In other words, even the women who fought like warriors were expected eventually to return to their role of obedient wife. Courage was temporary. Confinement was permanent. Daily life for women in feudal Japan wasn't simply difficult, it was scripted. Every gesture, every role, every possibility was narrowed down by a society obsessed with hierarchy. Even clothing reinforced it. Samurai wives wore subdued colors to show restraint. Peasant women wore plain homespun. Courtesans wore elaborate silks, but only as uniforms of their confinement. No matter the fabric, the pattern remained the same. Women's bodies and lives were not their own. The irony, of course, is that women shaped culture anyway. The haiku, the painted screens, the elegance of Edo period fashion, all bore the fingerprints of women who weren't supposed to leave much of a mark at all. And yet somehow, they did. Quietly. Permanently. So tonight, as you drift off, picture the contrasts. A grand castle rising above the countryside. Inside, a wife silenced by duty. Beyond the gates, a courtesan walking in impossible shoes through Yoshiwara. And further still, a peasant girl bent over a rice paddy, dreaming of nothing more than a full belly and a little peace. Different stations, same cage. And that is the unthinkable suffering of women in feudal Japan, admired for their silence, celebrated for their grace, but rarely allowed to be fully human. At the very top, samurai wives lived in sprawling estates. That sounds glamorous, and in some ways it was. They had servants, silks, and a status that peasants could only dream of. But, because there's always a but, they also had duties that looked less like romance and more like paperwork. Marriage was essentially a merger between families. Love had very little to do with it. A wife was expected to uphold honor, manage the household, and if necessary, defend it with a naginata, a sort of polearm, which is impressive, yes, but also a reminder that her husband might be off pursuing glory while she was left with the very practical job of holding the fort. The role of producing heirs weighed heavily too. Sons were the preferred outcome, of course. Daughters were useful only if they could be married off strategically. If a woman failed to produce children, or worse, produced the wrong ones, her status could slip alarmingly quickly. Divorce was shockingly easy for samurai men. All it required was a short written note, essentially saying, "Thanks but no thanks," and the wife was sent back to her family. So while the samurai wife might appear in delicate woodblock prints, seated serenely by a garden pond, her real life involved constant anxiety about childbirth, politics, and whether her husband's eye was wandering. Let's drift a little lower on the ladder. Peasant women. Their existence was less about ceremony and more about survival. They worked in rice fields, carried water, tended children, and prepared food. They were laborers in every sense, expected to contribute fully alongside their husbands. A woman who could not, or would not, work was considered a liability. This left very little time for poetry or fan-waving elegance. Life was mud, sweat, and aching backs. And yet, even here, expectations were rigid. Women were supposed to embody obedience and humility. Buddhism and Confucianism layered moral codes on top of already grueling lives, instructing women to serve fathers, husbands, and sons. Always serve, never lead. Interestingly, despite all this, women could sometimes own property or manage household finances. Practical necessity gave them responsibilities that philosophy denied them. The contradiction was rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging it might suggest women had value beyond obedience, and that was an uncomfortable thought in feudal Japan. Now, among merchants and artisans, the situation shifted again. Merchant families, especially in the later Edo period, grew wealthy. Wives in these households often managed businesses while their husbands mingled socially. Records show that merchant women frequently kept ledgers, oversaw apprentices, and made trade decisions. It's quietly ironic that women in these supposedly lower status classes often wielded more day-to-day power than samurai wives, who were trapped in an elaborate system of appearances. But, and you've probably noticed the theme, this influence was unofficial. Respectable society insisted they were merely helping their husbands. Their work was disguised as support, never as leadership. And then, there were the women who existed outside of this neat ladder. The entertainers, the courtesans, the ones whose lives were simultaneously glamorous and tragic. The oiran, for instance, occupied a paradoxical role. They were highly educated, skilled in music, art, poetry, and conversation, but their beauty and wit were packaged as commodities, bought and displayed for elite men. Their silk brocades and towering hairpieces dazzled the public, yet beneath the shimmer was a life with almost no freedom. Most oiran began as girls sold into brothels by desperate families. Training was brutal, designed to mold them into living art pieces. They studied long hours, endured strict discipline, and knew from the start that they belonged not to themselves, but to their patrons. What's striking is how society admired them publicly while condemning them morally. Men sought them out, boasted of their company, and even commissioned art of them. Yet those same men would never allow their wives or daughters near that life. Oiran embodied refinement and disgrace simultaneously. And for the women trapped in it, escape was almost impossible. Unless a wealthy patron paid an exorbitant fee to buy her freedom, she remained in service until she was too old to attract clients. At that point, many simply faded into poverty. So, whether noble or common, whether wife, peasant, or courtesan, women in feudal Japan lived within cages. Some cages were gilded, others were made of mud, but the bars were always there. And what makes this especially haunting is that their suffering was normalized. It wasn't scandalous, it wasn't unusual, it was simply life, expected, accepted, and quietly endured. Now, let's drift softly into another layer of irony. Despite their restricted roles, Japanese women in folklore and literature often appeared as powerful figures. Ghost stories, for instance, are full of vengeful female spirits, onryo, who return to punish cruel husbands or unfaithful lovers. These tales reflected cultural anxieties, yes, but they also revealed a quiet acknowledgement. Women denied power in life might reclaim it in death. Forced into political marriages as children, because for noble daughters in feudal Japan, marriage wasn't about affection or attraction or even basic compatibility. It was about alliances, family survival, land, titles, and sometimes simply about the quiet desperation of staying on the right side of whoever happened to be holding a sword. The cruelest part is that many of these marriages began when the brides were still children. Literally. Girls could be betrothed at 7 or 8, sometimes even younger. The ceremony might not be consummated until later, but from the moment of engagement, their lives were sealed. Childhood wasn't really childhood. It was preparation for a transaction. Let's drift gently through an example. In the courts of powerful daimyo, regional lords who were essentially mini-kings, daughters were bargaining chips. A 6-year-old girl might suddenly be whisked away, dressed in silks, too heavy for her little frame, and married into another clan. Not because she understood marriage, not because she had any say, but because her father needed an ally, or fewer enemies. The ceremony would be solemn and filled with ritual, poetic verses, shared cups of sake, elaborate gifts exchanged between families. On the surface, it was beautiful. Underneath, it was cold calculation. The bride herself was almost invisible in the arrangement, standing as a symbol rather than a person. Some girls were sent away to live in their husband's household long before they were truly women. Others remained with their natal families until they came of age, but in either case, their fate was already sealed. They belonged to someone else. And it wasn't just the nobility. Even samurai households used daughters this way, arranging marriages to secure loyalty among their peers. The ideal daughter was obedient, silent, and pliable enough to accept whatever match was chosen for her. Individual preference? That was a laughable notion. Of course, not every match was equally grim. Some young brides did grow to form affectionate partnerships with their husbands, but many did not. Imagine being 12 years old and moved into a household where your new husband might be twice your age, surrounded by retainers and in-laws who expected you to start producing heirs immediately. The weight of that expectation on a body and mind still developing was staggering. And yet, society didn't frame it as cruelty, it framed it as duty. A daughter who refused or who complained wasn't seen as a child with rights. She was seen as an obstacle to the family's ambitions. There's also the quiet tragedy of erasure. Once a girl married, she was no longer part of her birth family. In many ways, she ceased to exist as their daughter. Her loyalties, her identity, were expected to shift entirely to her husband's household. Letters home were rare, visits even rarer. For all intents and purposes, she vanished from the lives of her parents and siblings, except as a useful thread in the family's political web. And just to sprinkle in some irony, while daughters were bartered off as tokens of alliance, sons were the ones praised for carrying the family line, which meant that the actual human cost of these marriages was rarely discussed. A daughter's suffering was simply background noise in the dynastic chess game. Even emperors' daughters weren't exempt. Imperial princesses were routinely married off to cement ties between powerful clans and the throne. They lived lives of ceremony, hemmed in by etiquette so rigid that stepping outside the lines was nearly impossible. Their husbands were chosen for them, their children were raised as pawns in future alliances, and their voices carried little more than polite whispers. The eerie calm of all this is how normalized it was. People didn't see it as tragic. They saw it as practical, efficient, necessary. Only from our comfortable distance does it look so cold. At the time, it was just life. And that's the sad beauty of feudal politics. It wrapped up human lives, especially the most fragile ones, in silks and rituals, then used them as tokens. A 10-year-old bride, bowing low beneath her heavy headpiece, wasn't really a person anymore. She was a bridge between two men with ambitions. So when we talk about the suffering of women in feudal Japan, political marriages are one of the quietest, most haunting examples. No one screamed, no one fought in the streets. It was all serene, polished, beautiful, and deeply, profoundly unkind, treated as property, not people. In a samurai household, a daughter was rarely seen as an individual with her own path. She was a bargaining chip, a vessel for heirs, and occasionally, a financial cushion if she could be married off advantageously. In written documents, she might not even be named. Instead, she was referred to as the daughter of so-and-so, much the way you'd label a particularly nice horse, practical, impersonal, and rather depressing. Property law made this even clearer. Women could technically inherit land, but in practice, their holdings were usually managed by male relatives or immediately absorbed into their husband's estate. If a woman's father died, she didn't suddenly become the mistress of her land. She became the conduit through which the land flowed to her husband. And if she displeased her husband, divorce was relatively easy for him. He could write a simple mikudari-han, a short letter of dismissal, and she was gone. No trial, no deliberation. Just a slip of paper saying, essentially, "You're not mine anymore." Meanwhile, for her, leaving was nearly impossible. A wife had no recognized right to initiate divorce. She could only hope her husband grew bored enough, or magnanimous enough, to release her. Even within her own home, a wife had very little personal freedom. Her movements, her dress, her conversations, all fell under the scrutiny of her husband's household. Privacy was a foreign concept. Decisions about her children, even, were rarely hers to make. Sons belonged to the family line, not the mother. Daughters were future bargaining chips, just like she once had been. And if you think this treatment was reserved for the common classes, think again. Even the highest women in the land, the wives and concubines of shoguns, daimyo, and emperors, lived inside gilded cages. The famous uku, the women's quarters of Edo Castle, was a maze of rules, rituals, and surveillance. Hundreds of women lived there, ranked by status, competing for favor. None of them were free. Each was essentially a well-dressed prisoner in silk. It wasn't just physical confinement, it was existential. A woman's identity was rarely her own. She was her father's daughter, her husband's wife, her son's mother. The language itself reflected this. Wives were sometimes referred to in terms that translated roughly to house person. A person belonging to the house, not an independent soul. Now, because humans are humans, there were always small rebellions. A sharp-witted woman might find ways to influence decisions behind the scenes. Some wives and concubines managed to wield soft power through charm, cleverness, or careful manipulation. But even these rare figures operated inside boundaries drawn by men. Step too far outside, and their entire lives could be stripped away with a single letter of dismissal. The strangest part is how calmly society accepted it. The idea that women were property wasn't framed as cruelty. It was framed as order, harmony. The Great social balance was maintained by everyone staying in their place. A woman who tried to live outside that role wasn't seen as brave. She was seen as disruptive, disharmonious, almost dangerous. And so, women moved through their days in carefully prescribed rhythms, their value measured not by their thoughts, but by their obedience, not by their desires, but by the alliances they represented. To us, that looks like dehumanization. To them, it was the natural order of things, which is, of course, a very polite way of saying they were treated like property. So the tragedy of feudal womanhood wasn't always loud. It wasn't always violent. Often, it was quiet, elegant, and suffocating, like being wrapped in layers of silk that looked beautiful but left you unable to breathe.